Today on the Bass channel, we are appreciating the VT bass from Tech 21. Now, I say appreciating instead of checking out or reviewing because really the VT bass is nothing new. We've all known about it for years, decades maybe, and it has deservedly so become one of the best bass preamps on the market. I know that title might be contended with the bass driver, but in my humble opinion, I think the VT bass edges out the bass driver for a couple reasons that we'll get into a little bit later in the video. But you'll also notice that I have the rack unit, whereas the tones are showing a graphic of the pedal. I sold my pedal, the VT Bass DI, some years ago in favor of this, just because it works with my setup a little better. I'm running out of shelf and drawer space for pedals and preamps and various things, and this just kind of slides right into the rack, and it just, again, works a little bit better for my setup. Now, you'll notice on the backside, this has a couple additional I/O compatibility features over the DI pedal. You've got two XLR outs, you've got an effects loop, you've got 1/4 inch outs, you've got an additional input. We're not gonna cover any of that in this video because there are a plethora of different variations of the VT Bass circuit. We've got the VT Bass Character Series, the VT Bass DI, the VT Bass Deluxe. There was a couple different amplifier heads, the 1969 one, there was the 500, the 1000, there were a couple combos, and of course, the rack unit. So to the best of my understanding, the internal circuitry as far as the tone shaping doesn't change between the amp and the DI pedal and the Character Series and the rack unit and whatever else sports the VT Bass name. It's more of an in and out compatibility, whether it's rack mount, pedal mount, amplifier, etc. I think the Deluxe has programmable presets. Point being, the tone is the same. So the reason I'm not showcasing any of this backside stuff and any special things that the rack unit does is because whether you have the DI, Character Series, amplifier, what have you, theoretically you should be able to get all of these tones with any of those VT Bass products. So like I said at the top, the VT Bass has been around for a long time, and it is one of the most popular, if not the most popular bass preamp in existence. And I think the big reason for that is because it's based on, it's emulating, it's designed to sound like a classic SVT. And while there are plenty of other amp manufacturers like GK or Ashdown or your favorite amp manufacturer that I forgot to name just now, making great stuff, I feel like the SVT has kind of come into that P-bass territory to where it's the go-to, it's the sound, and it's the question is it objectively the best possible sound, or is it the one that we're so used to hearing that we think it's the best? I think that probably doesn't matter because it's the one that we want to hear, and I would have to say Tech 21 absolutely nailed the character, pun intended, the vibe, the response, and the tone of a classic SVT, whether you've got it clean, sparkly, or ripping and gritty. So the one thing that's proof positive for me to know that Tech 21 nailed it on the SVT response is that for me, personally, to my ear, to my taste, when you're by yourself in a room, or in my case, recording a demo video by yourself, I don't care for the sound of a broken up SVT, like the real deal tube overdrive SVT tone. And maybe that's just a generational thing that, I didn't grow up in the 70s. I grew up with distortion pedals. Distortion pedals are older than I am, so I've known them my whole life. Much like kids in elementary school don't know a world without YouTube, and most of us do. Point being, I prefer the sound of a bass overdrive pedal to the real deal. And that is the same case here. There's settings that I can dial in that I do enjoy, but generally this has a similar kind of breakup that, again, to my ear alone in the room, I don't care for. But that doesn't matter because once it goes into a mix, it does its job, it does what it's supposed to, it makes the bass feel bigger and it saturates the right frequencies and it helps you stand out in the places that you want to stand out but not be overbearing and step on toes in the areas that you don't. Now, speaking of fitting in a mix, we got to talk about this EQ. Going off of memory here, I'm going to put them up here just in case I'm wrong. But the bass knob is 80 hertz, the mid knob is 1 kilohertz or 1000 hertz, and the treble knob is 3.2 kilohertz or 3200 hertz. Now, the bass being at 80 can be problematic sometimes depending on who you are, what you play, and what you play, meaning the bass that you play and the style you play. Either way, it can get out of control a little bit too quickly, so just be tasteful with that 80 hertz. But again, a lot of these recordings are gonna kind of dip out a lot of stuff below 50 hertz anyway. Again, your project may vary. What I'm saying here is not gospel, it's just generally speaking, stuff under 50 hertz is gonna get rolled off, so it's not a huge deal. The shining star, in my opinion, is the mid-range, being centered at 1 kilohertz. Now, I don't know the specific Q, it doesn't sound super narrow to me, but 1 kilohertz is a really cool frequency to dip or to boost, because depending on what the guitar's doing, and depending on maybe what style you're playing, it works great both ways. In my case, I've noticed that a lot of the music that I record, which is usually rock, heavy rock, borderline on metal, not modern metal, but classic metal, the guitars usually seem to have a void between 1 kilohertz and 2 kilohertz. My sweet spot usually is 1.5, but 1 kilohertz is close enough to just boost it a little bit to help you jump out and also live amongst the guitars in addition to the kick drum. However, if you're more of a thump and pluck type of player, 1 kilohertz is again a great frequency to duck out, because when you start talking about 400, 500, 600 hertz, those can also sound pleasant to your ear to reduce when you're alone in a room. In a mix, depending on the mix, you might find that all of the body and all of the substance of your tone also disappears right along with it, to where, again, 500 hertz by itself is a little bit boxy, and it's a little unpleasant to boost when you're alone. Sometimes in the right mix, it's the perfect frequency to boost. However, by cutting 1 kilohertz, you still get a lot of that perceived clean, crisp, hi-fi tone, but because it's kind of in the upper end of the mid-range, you don't lose all of the body. And again, I know all of this is dependent on your specific mix and play style and instrument and genre and all that sort of thing. But just painting with broad strokes, generally speaking, you can afford to dip out 1 kilohertz and not completely lose your entire signal in the mix. Finally, the treble being centered at 3.2 kilohertz. Now, because this video is not sponsored and Tech21 as of right now doesn't know I'm making it, I can go ahead and mention Dark Glass and not have any conflict of interest. Specifically, the Dark Glass tone capsule that you find in the Dingwall NG2, that treble, which is labeled as a high mid, is centered at 3.2 kilohertz. And having your treble centered at 3.2 kilohertz instead of the more conventional 4K, 5K, sometimes upwards of 7K. Now again, there's merit in that too, I'm not knocking it, but depending on, again, who you are and how you play, it can get a little too much, especially if it's a shelving boost. Then you're boosting 9K and 10K, and when done tastefully, it's fine, but it's easy to get it to a really unpleasant, harsh ice pick kind of way. But having, this here, the Dark Glass Tone Capsule, even some of their other preamps like the Alpha Omega, there's a 3.2 kilohertz frequency, and I find, particularly when I'm dialing in tones for Josh when he does covers or whatever he's doing, 3.2 is a sweet spot to give you that same perceived top-end, kind of aggressive boost if you want a little bit more attitude and top-end and distortion in your signal to cut through, but without being... By the way, this is not scripted at all. This is just top of my head, so you're going to see a lot of cuts. But the point is, having your treble frequency at 3.2 allows you to get that same perceived kind of aggressive pushed top end, whether it's distortion or clean, without having those troubles of potentially becoming too ice picky. Now, the other cool feature of the VT bass is the blend knob. Now, I don't know about all pedals, but there's some, I can't think of them off the top of my head, where the blend knob, as you would expect, it blends between your dry signal and your affected signal. Now, that can mean a couple of different things, and in the case of some pedals, clean, bypass, dry, unaffected is one thing, and then affected is another. So if you're blending between your unaffected, meaning no distortion and no EQ, that's one thing. If you're talking about blend between your non-distorted and distorted, that's a different thing. This one is the latter. So when you dial in more of the clean sound in your blend, or blend at a lower position, you still get the effects of the EQ, but you're blending between the distorted and non-distorted. So the good news of that for me is someone who doesn't always necessarily enjoy the flavor of this style classic SVT tube-driven pushed thing. Blending between that is really nice, meaning I can get a little bit more drive while blending the clean signal right about noon, maybe 11, maybe 1 o'clock, somewhere in that window. I can still get all of the effects that I love about the EQ while not being overbearingly distorted. Putting that same feature in tandem with the character knob, there's a number of ways you can describe the character knob, and the Tech 21 literature likens it to different ampegs. Below the 12 o'clock position is more of an SVT flavor, and the 12 o'clock position is the flip-top flavor. What it sounds like to me is it's just saturating different frequencies in the drive. So as you crank the character knob up, your drive gets brighter, and as you crank it down, your drive gets darker. Now, depending on where your blend is going to yield different results. I found that if I do a higher blend, 2, 3, maybe even max, I'm using clock positions, by the way, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. I found that the character being a little bit lower provides a sweeter kind of a top end, but if I want more aggressive gain, then I dial the blend back to 12 or maybe 11. And then I can crank the character knob to where I'm mostly perceiving the distortion in the top end, not the bottom end, which is where, for me, I don't care for the distortion in the bottom end because it gets a little bit just unpleasant. So it's hard to know exactly where to classify this in the grand scheme of everything. Is it a one-trick pony that is just an SVT, or is it a multi-trick pony that works in every genre? And the answer is kind of both. Because while I think, hopefully, during this video I've proven that it can work in just about any genre, I covered as many as I realistically could here, It also really has a setting and a vibe that it really excels at, which is slight boost in your bass and treble, slight dip in your mid-range, a little bit higher on the blend, a little bit lower on the drive and character, and for me, that's kind of where I feel like this excels, and that's what I want to hear out of this the most. Because again, purely just an opinion thing, I'm not telling you what's right or wrong. When it comes to higher gain, higher drive settings, I usually want to hear something else, but that being said, I mean, I think we've proven in this video that the VT bass can do the more modern, aggressive, higher gain, top end, bright, clanky kind of thing. So that is just about it for me and my unscripted rambling about the VT bass from Tech 21. Again, let me know what you thought down below in the comments. Give the video a like, a subscribe, all of the YouTube calls to engagement. And until next time, be safe, and I'll see you later.